In the year 1220, the greatest city in Central Asia was Samarkand. It was a jewel of the Islamic world, a metropolis of soaring minarets, domes of turquoise tile, libraries bursting with ancient knowledge, and markets that sold silk from China, spices from India, and silver from Persia. Its walls were massive, its army was tens of thousands strong, and its people believed they were safe. They had heard rumors, of course, whispers of a new power rising in the east, a tribe of nomads who fought like demons on horseback. But Samarkand had stood for 1,000 years. It had seen empires rise and fall. What was one more tribe of barbarians from the steppe? And one morning, the horizon darkened, not with clouds, with riders, tens of thousands of them, moving in perfect, terrifying silence, their horses' hoofs muffled by the grass of the plain. They carried bows that could punch an arrow through armor at 300 paces. They rode horses so tough they could survive on nothing but frozen grass and snow. And they were led by a man whose name would soon be spoken in terror from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe. A man who had united the warring tribes of Mongolia through blood, betrayal, and an unshakable vision of world conquest. A man named Genghis Khan. What happened to Samarkand next was not a battle. It was an extinction event. The city fell in 5 days. Its army was annihilated. Its people were herded into the open, and then the killing began. The skulls of the dead were piled into pyramids as a warning to the next city, and the next, and the next, because the Mongols were not just coming, they were already here, and they would not stop. This is the story of the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous land empire in the entire history of the human species, an empire that, at its height, stretched across 24 million square kilometers, from the frozen forests of Siberia to the burning deserts of Persia, from the rice paddies of China to the wheat fields of Hungary, an empire that contained over 100 million people, nearly a quarter of the world's population at the time, an empire built not by accident, not by luck, but by a system of warfare, communication, administration, and sheer, unrelenting terror that the world had never seen before, and has never seen again. The Mongols did not simply conquer nations. They erased them. They erased entire civilizations from the map. They turned great cities into ghost towns. They changed the genetic makeup of entire regions through slaughter on an industrial scale. And yet, they also created the first globalized world. They connected East and West in a way that had never happened before. They built a system of international law, a passport system, a pony express that could carry a message from Beijing to Baghdad in 2 weeks. They protected trade routes so effectively that it was said a virgin carrying a pot of gold could walk from one end of the empire to the other and not be touched. The Mongol Empire was a paradox. It was a machine of unprecedented destruction and a vehicle of unprecedented creation. And to understand it, we have to go back to the beginning. To the frozen, windswept steppe, to a boy who was born with nothing, clutching a blood clot in his tiny fist, a boy who should have died 100 times before his 10th birthday, a boy who would become the most feared and most consequential human being of his millennium, a boy named Temujin. The Mongolian steppe is one of the harshest environments on Earth. In the summer, the sun beats down without mercy, and the grasslands stretch to the horizon in an endless, swaying ocean of green. In the winter, the temperature drops to 40 below zero, and the wind screams across a frozen desert of snow and ice. There are no trees for shelter, no stone for building, no cities, no walls, no permanent structures of any kind. The people who lived here, the nomads, were shaped by this land like iron is shaped by the hammer. They were born in the saddle. They learned to ride before they learned to walk. They could shoot a bow with lethal accuracy from the back of a galloping horse. They could survive on nothing but fermented mare's milk and dried meat for weeks. They worshipped the eternal blue sky. Tengri, a vast, impersonal god who cared nothing for human suffering, and they fought constantly. Tribe against tribe, clan against clan, blood feud against blood feud. It was into this world that Temujin was born, probably in the year 1162, near the Annan River. The legend, recorded in the secret history of the Mongols, says he was born clutching a blood clot in his fist. A sign, the shaman said, that he was destined to rule the world. But destiny is a fickle thing. When Temujin was 9 years old, his father, Yesujay, a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, was poisoned by a rival tribe, the Tatars. During a peace negotiation, the family was cast out. Yesujay's followers abandoned his widow and her children, taking the clan's livestock with them. Temujin, his mother Holan, and his siblings were left alone on the steppe with nothing, no herds, no protection, no food. The secret history records Holland digging for wild roots and catching fish with her bare hands to feed her children. It records Temujin killing his own older half-brother, Vettir, in a fight over a stolen fish. Holland's fury at this act is one of the most powerful passages in the entire text. She screams at her son, calling him a wild dog, a wolf cub, a creature of darkness, but she cannot undo what has been done. Temujin, still a boy, has committed murder. He has shown that he will not be crossed. He has shown the iron that lives inside him. Then, things got worse. Temujin was captured by a rival clan, the Tachiad. They locked him in a heavy wooden cane, a yoke that went around his neck and wrists, and planned to execute him. But one night, Temujin managed to escape. He knocked his guard unconscious with the cane, slipped into a river, and floated downstream, breathing through a reed, until his pursuers gave up the search. This escape, this impossible, desperate, brilliant escape, is one of the foundational moments of his life. He had been left for dead. He had survived. Slowly, painstakingly, Temujin began to build his power. He was not the strongest warrior. He was not the richest man. But he had something more valuable than either of those things. He had a vision. He understood that the old system of tribal warfare was a dead end. Mongols could never be free as long as they were fighting each other. The only path to survival was unity. And so he did something revolutionary. He built a new kind of army, one based not on tribal loyalty, but on personal merit. If you were brave and capable, Temujin would promote you, regardless of your birth. His closest generals included former enemies, men who had once tried to kill him. He recruited from the lowest classes, from the outcasts and the orphans. He created a brotherhood of warriors who were loyal not to a clan or a bloodline, but to him, personally. And he gave them a new law, the Asa, a code of conduct that was brutal in its simplicity. No stealing from each other, no desertion, no betraying your commander. The penalty for any of these was death, but the reward for loyalty was a share in the spoils of war, a place at the feast, and the promise of a world where Mongols ruled over all. By the year 1206, Temujin had done what no one had ever done before. He had united every Mongol tribe under a single banner. A great council, a Kurultai, was held, and the assembled chieftains acclaimed him as Genghis Khan. The name is debated. It may mean oceanic ruler, meaning the ruler of all who live between the oceans. It may mean fierce ruler. Whatever its exact meaning, it meant one thing to the world. A new power had been born, and it was hunger. To understand how the Mongols conquered the world, you have to understand their army. It was, quite simply, the most effective military force on the planet for over a century. And its effectiveness was not based on any single magical weapon. It was based on a combination of factors that no other army could match. The first was the horse. The Mongolian horse is a small, checky, unglamorous animal. It does not look like a war horse. It looks like a pony. But it is the toughest horse on earth. It can survive on grass alone, forging through snow with its hoofs. It can travel 60 to 80 miles in a single day, a pace no infantry army could dream of matching. And each Mongol warrior had not one, but 3, 4, even 5 horses. This meant he could ride one horse until it tired, then simply switch to a fresh mount without stopping. The result was an army that could move across the landscape with a speed that seemed supernatural to its enemies. A Mongol army could appear over a ridge at dawn, destroy a village, and be 50 miles away by sunset. They fought a war of movement when their enemies were still fighting a war of static positions. They did not care about holding ground. They cared about destroying the enemy's ability to fight. The second factor was the bow. The Mongol composite bow was a weapon of astonishing power and precision, made from layers of horn, sinew, and wood, laminated together and dried for years. It had a draw weight of up to 160 pounds, nearly twice that of a typical English longbow. It could fire an arrow accurately at 300 meters and still kill a man through his armor. And the Mongols had perfected the art of shooting from horseback. The Parthian shot, firing backwards while riding away at a full gallop, was a standard skill, not a trick. Every Mongol warrior could loose a dozen arrows in the time it took a European crossbowman to reload once. A Mongol army did not close with the enemy if it could avoid it. It circled. It harassed. It rained arrows from a distance until the enemy formation broke. And then, when the enemy broke, the heavy cavalry charged with lances and swords and finished the slaughter. The third factor was command and control. Genghis Khan reorganized the army into decimal units: Arbans of 10, Suns of 100, Mangans of 1,000, and Tumans of 10,000. Each unit had a commander, and orders were transmitted through a system of flags, torches, and a corps of messengers who rode relay horses across the battlefront. The discipline was absolute. If one man in a unit fled, the entire unit was executed. This bred a level of unit cohesion that was unbreakable. But perhaps the most important factor was intelligence. Before the Mongols ever attacked a kingdom, they sent in merchants, spies, and scouts. They mapped every road, every river crossing, every mountain pass. They identified the political fractures in the enemy's court. They knew which nobles could be bribed, which generals could be provoked into a foolish charge, which cities had weak walls. They practiced psychological warfare on a scale the world had never seen. They spread rumors that turned allies against each other. They used captured prisoners as human shields, driving them ahead of the army to absorb the enemy's arrows. They promised the city peace if it surrendered, and total annihilation if it resisted. They were utterly, terrifyingly consistent in their threats. Once the Mongol tribes were united, Genghis Khan had a problem. He had a massive, highly trained army and a fragile new nation. If he did not give his warriors a target, they would turn on each other again. The target he chose was the Roman Xia kingdom, a sophisticated state in what is now northwestern China, ruled by the Tangda people. The Roman Xia were wealthy, with walled cities, irrigated farmland, and a literate Buddhist culture. They were not steppe nomads, they were a settled civilization. And in 1209, the Mongols came for them. The Roman Xia campaign revealed something about the Mongols that the world was slow to understand. They were not mindless savages, they were learning machines. Every siege they conducted, they captured enemy engineers and craftsmen and put them to work. They learned how to build siege engines, catapults, trebuchets, battering rams, siege towers. They learned how to dam rivers and flood cities. By the time they reached the Roman Xia capital, they were no longer a steppe cavalry army. They were a combined arms force that could crack the walls of any fortress on earth. The Roman Xia submitted and became vassals of the Khan. It was a pattern that would repeat. Submit, pay tribute, and provide troops, and you would be spared. Resist, and you would be erased. The next target was far larger. The Jin dynasty controlled northern China, a land of 50 million people, massive stone fortresses, and an army that dwarfed the Mongol force by orders of magnitude. It was an ant attacking an elephant, and the ant won. The critical moment came in 1211 at the Battle of the Badger's Mouth Pass. The Jin army, hundreds of thousands strong, was camped in a narrow valley. The Mongols, outnumbered perhaps 5 to 1, attacked with a fury that the Chinese chroniclers struggle to describe. They used the feigned retreat, the classic steppe tactic. The Mongol center appeared to break and flee in panic. The Jin cavalry charged after them, believing the battle was won. The retreating Mongols led them for miles, stringing them out, tiring their horses. And then, at a predetermined point, the Mongol wings closed in like the jaws of a trap. The Jin cavalry was surrounded and annihilated. The Mongol heavy cavalry then turned on the Jin infantry, which was now leaderless and exposed. The slaughter was so complete that the bones of the dead were said to have whitened the ground for years afterward. In 1215, the Mongols took Chengdu, the Jin capital, now modern Beijing. The city burned for a month. The Jin emperor fled south. The northern half of China was now under Mongol control. Genghis Khan had done what no steppe nomad had ever done. He had conquered a settled empire, but the world had not yet seen the worst of him. That would come next, in the West, in a campaign that would transform the Mongol Empire from a regional power into a world historical cataclysm. The Khwarezmian Empire, in 1218, was one of the great powers of the Islamic world. It stretched across modern-day Iran, Afghanistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and parts of Kazakhstan. Its Shah, Alaa ad-Din Muhammad Roman II, commanded an army of over 400,000 men. His cities were legendary for their wealth and beauty. Samarkand, Bukhara, Merv, Ishapur, Herat. These were centers of art, science, philosophy, and trade. The Shah, arrogant and suspicious, believed himself to be the most powerful man on earth. He had reason to believe it. What he did not understand was that the Mongols were not an enemy he could fight with traditional means. Genghis Khan, having just secured the submission of the Roman Xia and much of northern China, was not looking for war with the Khwarezmians. He sent a trade caravan, over 400 merchants, to the Khwarezmian city of Otrar, bearing a message of peace and a proposal for mutually beneficial trade along the Silk Road. The governor of Otrar, a man named Inalchik, who was a relative of the Shah, decided the caravan was a spy mission. He seized the merchants and executed them all, confiscating their goods. Genghis Khan, still seeking to avoid war, sent 3 envoys directly to the Shah. demanding the governor be punished and the stolen goods returned. The Shah's response was to kill one of the envoys and send the other two back with their beard shaved, a mortal insult. When word reached Genghis Khan, he climbed to the top of a mountain, removed his hat and his belt, and bowed his head to the ground. He prayed for 3 days and 3 nights to the eternal blue sky. Then he stood up, and he uttered the words that would doom millions. I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you. The storm that was about to break upon the Khwarezmian Empire was unlike anything in human history. The Mongol army that crossed the Tian Shan Mountains in the winter of 1219 was between 100 and 150,000 men. It moved in multiple columns, each commanded by one of the Khan's sons or his greatest generals, the brilliant strategist Subutai, the relentless Jeep, the steady Chagatai, the scholarly Jakai. The Shah, with this huge army, did not concentrate his forces. He scattered them across his cities. A catastrophic strategic blunder. He was terrified of the Mongols, and he hoped his walls would protect him. They did not. The Mongols first struck at Otrar, the city where the caravan had been murdered. The siege lasted 5 months. The governor, Endalchik, defended the city with desperate courage, knowing he would receive no mercy. He was right. When the city fell, the Mongols dragged him out, and they executed him by pouring molten silver into his ears and eyes, a poetic revenge for the theft of the merchant silver. And the army split. Genghis Khan took one column towards Bukhara. His son Taliyi took another towards the great cities of Khorasan. Jachai and Chagatai moved on the cities of the north. The Shah, paralyzed, fled from city to city, pursued by the relentless general Subutai and Jeeb. This pursuit would become legendary. Subutai and Jeeb, with a force of 20,000 men, chased the Shah across his entire empire, covering thousands of miles, never letting him rest, never letting him rally his forces. The Shah eventually fled to a small island in the Caspian Sea, where he died, alone and broken, his empire a smoking ruin behind him. Bukhara fell, the city of scholars, of poets, of one of the oldest libraries in the Islamic world. Genghis Khan rode his horse into the great mosque, looked up at the beautiful arches and the glittering chandeliers, and asked, "Is this the palace of the Shah?" He was told it was the house of God. He said nothing. He ordered the wooden chests that held the Qurans to be emptied and used as feed troughs for the Mongol horses. The imams and scholars were made to serve the horses, and men were executed. The city was put to the torch. The famous library, with its irreplaceable manuscripts, was burned to ash. But Bukhara was just the beginning. The worst was yet to come. After Bukhara, the Mongols marched on Samarkand. The city's garrison was 50,000 men. It had massive walls and a citadel. The Mongols surrounded it, brought up their siege engines, and began a relentless assault. They used captured prisoners as human shields, forcing them to push the battering rams and climb the scaling ladders ahead of the Mongol warriors. The psychological effect was devastating. The defenders saw their own countrymen, their neighbor, their relatives, being driven towards the walls. Some refused to shoot. Those who did shot their arrows into the bodies of innocents. After 5 days, the garrison broke. A large portion of the Turkic soldiers in the Shah's army, seeing the hopelessness of their position, surrendered en masse. The Mongols accepted their surrender. And then, once they were disarmed, they slaughtered them all. It was a standard Mongol tactic. Troops who surrendered too late in a siege were considered to have forfeited their right to live. The civilian population of Samarkand was driven out of the city and into the open plain. The craftsmen, the engineers, the skilled workers were separated out and sent back to Mongolia. The young women and children were taken as slaves. The rest, the men, the old women, the young boys, were systematically executed. The chroniclers of the time, the Arab historian Ibn al-Athir among them, wrote that the number of dead was so great that the air stank for miles and the rivers ran red for weeks. Ibn al-Athir, who lived through this period, began his account of the Mongol invasion with the words, "For some years I continued averse from mentioning this event, deeming it so horrible that I shrank from recording it." He called it the greatest catastrophe in human history. But the campaign of terror was not yet over. Genghis Khan's youngest son, Taliyin, was given the task of subduing the region of Khorasan, in what is now eastern Iran and western Afghanistan. Taliyin was perhaps the most ruthless of all the Khan's sons. He was a brilliant general, cold, efficient, and utterly without mercy. His campaign in Khorasan in the spring of 1221 is one of the most chilling episodes in the history of warfare. City after city fell to him, and each one was treated the same way. Bal, the ancient city that had been a center of Zoroastrianism and Buddhism before Islam, was razed to the ground, and its entire population was killed. Deshapur, a great city of learning, fell after a fierce resistance. The Mongols were particularly enraged because Taliu's brother-in-law, the husband of Genghis Khan's daughter, had been killed by an arrow from the walls of Nishapur. The princess herself demanded revenge. When the city fell, Taliu ordered that not a single living thing be left alive. Men, women, children, even cats and dogs, were slaughtered. The heads were piled into pyramids. The city was leveled so completely that the site was plowed over and planted with barley. Merv was one of the greatest cities in the world, a metropolis on the Silk Road with a population that may have reached several 100,000. It was a center of astronomy, mathematics, and Islamic scholarship. Its libraries were vast, its markets were rich. Taliu arrived before Merv with his army. In the city, after some initial skirmishing, surrender, the Mongols promised that the population would be spared if they obeyed. They were lying. The population was marched out of the city and divided. The skilled craftsmen and young women were taken. The rest, every man, woman, and child, was distributed among the Mongol soldiers, who were each given a quota of people to kill. The chronicler Juvayni, writing a generation later, recorded that the killing at Merv took 13 days. The entire city was then burned. The great irrigation dams that had watered the oasis for centuries were destroyed. Merv never recovered. Today, it is a massive archaeological site in the desert, a city of ghosts. Herat was similar. The city resisted, and when it fell, the population was annihilated. Only a few dozen people were said to have survived the massacre. The region of Khorasan, which had been one of the most prosperous and culturally sophisticated regions on Earth, was turned into a wasteland. The population crash was so severe that the demographic map of Central Asia was permanently altered. Some estimates suggest that the Mongol invasions of the Khwarezmian Empire killed between 2 and 4 million people in a period of about 2 years. The scale of death is almost incomprehensible, even by the brutal standards of medieval warfare. While Genghis Khan was consolidating the conquest of the Khwarezmian heartland, 2 of his greatest generals, Subutai and Cheap, were embarking on one of the most extraordinary military expeditions in history. Their mission had started as the pursuit of the fleeing Shah, but after the Shah died on his Caspian highland, they were given a new and audacious order: ride north, circle the Caspian Sea, explore the lands beyond, and report back on everything you find. Subutai and Cheap took a force of 20,000 men and vanished into the north. They crossed the Caucasus Mountains, a feat that military historians still marvel at. They fought their way through the kingdom of Georgia, crushing a Georgian army in a brilliantly executed ambush. They moved into the steppes of what is now southern Russia, where they encountered a coalition of steppe peoples, the Cumans, Alans, and others, and they defeated them in detail, using diplomacy to isolate them before destroying them one by one. The Cumans fled west, seeking refuge in the lands of the Kievan Rus. The Russian princes, for once, united in the face of this strange new enemy from the east. A grand coalition of Rus princes assembled an army and marched out to meet the Mongols. The two forces met on the banks of the Kalkar River in 1223. The Rus army was larger, but it was a feudal levy, with poor coordination between the different princes. The Mongols, as always, used the feigned retreat. They fell back for 9 days, drawing the Rus forces deeper and deeper into the steppe, stretching their lines of communication, exhausting their horses. At the Kalkar River, the Mongols turned and attacked. The Rus army was crushed. The captured princes were tied up and laid on the ground, and a wooden platform was placed over them. The Mongol commanders then held a victory feast on the platform, slowly crushing the princes to death beneath them. It was a deliberate act of psychological terror, a message to the Christian world about what awaited them. Subutai and Cheap then continued their ride, skirting the Black Sea, raiding the trading posts of the Genos and Crimea, and then turning east again, rejoining the main Mongol army somewhere in the vastness of the steppe. In the space of 3 years, they had ridden over 5,000 miles, defeated every army that had stood against them, and gathered a vast trove of intelligence about the lands of Europe. Subutai, who was born a simple tribesman, had become the greatest cavalry general in human history. He had surveyed the approaches to Europe. He had identified the weak points, and he had planted in the mind of the Mongol leadership an ambition that would grow over the next decade: the conquest of the West. In 1227, while campaigning against the rebellious Roman 11th kingdom, Genghis Khan fell from his horse. The fall caused internal injuries, and a 65-year-old Khan, the man who had conquered half the world, knew his time was near. He summoned his sons to his bedside. The succession was the most delicate issue in the empire. His eldest son, Jachet, whose paternity had always been questioned due to his motherboard's abduction by a rival tribe years before, had already died, possibly poisoned on his father's orders, after a bitter rift between them. His second son, Chagatai, was a strict follower of the law but had a violent temper and a deep hatred for Jachet's line. His third son, Dojde, was genial, generous, and a master of diplomacy, beloved by the troops, but given to heavy drinking. His fourth son, Talyudan, the youngest, was the greatest general, the keeper of the hearth, the traditional inheritance of the youngest son and Mongol custom. Genghis made his choice. He chose Ojde. He knew that an empire needed not just a warrior but a politician, a man who could manage the rivalries between brothers and keep the fragile unity of the Mongol nation intact. His last words to his sons were a warning: if you remain together, you can conquer the world. If you fall apart, you will lose everything. He died in August 1227. His body was carried back to Mongolia in secret. Legend says that every living thing encountered by the funeral procession, human or animal, was killed to keep the burial site secret. He was buried in an unmarked grave somewhere in the mountains of northern Mongolia, possibly near the sacred Birken Kaldon Peak. The location remains unknown to this day. Genghis Khan had passed into the realm of legend, but his empire lived on. Ojde was elected Great Khan in 1229, and he quickly proved his father's choice had been wise. He completed the destruction of the Jin dynasty in northern China. He built a magnificent capital, Karakoram, in the heart of Mongolia, a cosmopolitan city that drew merchants, priests, and ambassadors from across the known world. He reformed the tax system, the postal relay system, and the administration of the conquered territories. And then, in 1235, he convened a great Kurultai to decide the next great campaign. The decision was made: the Mongols would return to the west, and the army would be led by Subutai, the veteran of the Great Raid, now in his 60s, and by Badu, the son of Jachet, who would rule the westernmost portion of the empire. The target was Europe. In 1236, an army of perhaps 100,000 Mongols, with a corps of pure Mongol cavalry and a larger contingent of Turkic allies, began moving west. Subutai's strategic plan was brilliant in its scope. He understood that Europe was a patchwork of squabbling kingdoms, papal intrigues, and fragile alliances. The greatest power was Hungary, a kingdom of horsemen whose Magyar ancestors had come from the steppe themselves centuries before. Hungary was the key. If Hungary fell, the road to Austria, Germany, and beyond was open. But first, the Mongols had to secure their flanks. The Russian principalities, which had never recovered from the disaster at the Kalkar River 13 years earlier, were the first target. This time, the Mongols came not to raid but to conquer. They brought their full siege train. They brought their Chinese engineers. The wooden walls of Russian cities, which had held against local enemies for centuries, were no match for Mongol catapults and battering rams. Ryazan fell. Kalama fell. Moscow, then a small town, was burned. Vladimir, the grand princely capital, was taken after a short siege, and its entire population was slaughtered in the city's main cathedral, where they had fled for sanctuary. The Grand Prince of Vladimir was killed in battle. The city of Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, the ancient capital of the Rus, fell in December 1240. The Mongol general Batu sent his envoy to demand surrender. The people of Kiev, in a gesture of defiant pride, killed the envoy. A few days later, the Mongol army surrounded the city. The noise of their siege engines, the screaming of the arrows, the endless drums, was said to be so loud that people inside the city could not hear each other speak. Kiev fell. The city of golden domes was reduced to a smoking ruin. The chronicler of Kiev wrote that only a few hundred people survived, huddled in the ruins of the Church of the Tides. The conquest of the Rus was complete. It would be more than 200 years before Russia fully threw off the Mongol yoke. The period of the Tatar yoke, as it came to be called, would fundamentally alter Russian history, cutting it off from the Renaissance and the Reformation, and instilling a tradition of autocratic, centralized power that would echo down through the Tsars to the Soviet Union and beyond. With the northern flank secure, the Mongols turned south and west. The army divided into multiple columns, a classic Mongol tactic designed to confuse and scatter the enemy's defenses. One column struck into Poland, another moved through the Carpathian Mountains into Transylvania. The main force, under Batu and Subutai, drove straight for the heart of Hungary. The Mongols moved in winter, a season when European armies traditionally disbanded and went home. The frozen rivers and marshes became highways for the Mongol cavalry. The Duke of Silesia, Henry the Pious, assembled a mixed army of Poles, Germans, and Teutonic Knights to block the northern Mongol column. The two armies met at Liegnitz, also called Legnik, in April 1241. The European knights, heavily armored and supremely confident, charged the Mongol lines. The Mongols fell back, their light cavalry firing arrows as they retreated. The knights, believing they were routing the enemy, broke formation and pursued. They were led directly into a prepared killing ground. Mongol heavy cavalry crashed into their flanks. Polish infantry advancing to support the knights was met with a wall of arrows. Henry the Pious was killed. The Mongols took his head, stuck it on a spear, and paraded it before the walls of Liegnitz. The northern army was annihilated. 2 days later, and hundreds of miles to the south, the main Mongol army faced King Belar Roman IV of Hungary at the Battle of Mohi. The Hungarian army was large and well equipped, with heavy cavalry, crossbowmen, and a strong defensive position on the Saja River. Batu, in command, attempted a frontal crossing of the river and was repulsed with heavy losses. It was one of the few times a Mongol assault was stopped cold. But Subutai, the master strategist, was not with Batu at that moment. He had taken a smaller force downstream, found a hidden fort, and crossed the river in secret. As the Hungarians celebrated their victory over Batu's assault, Subutai's force appeared on their flank and rear. The Hungarian camp, a massive, densely packed wagon fort, became a trap. The Mongols surrounded it and began shooting flaming arrows and fire bombs into the crowded camp. The Hungarians panicked. The retreat turned into a rout, and the rout turned into a massacre. King Bela escaped with his life, fleeing to an island off the Dalmatian coast. The Mongol army fanned out across the Hungarian plain, burning towns and villages, rounding up the population. Europe was in a state of absolute terror. There was no army left between the Mongols and Vienna. Between the Mongols and the heart of Western Europe, Pope Gregory Roman IX called for a crusade. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Roman II, who was locked in a bitter power struggle with the Pope, sent frantic letters to the other monarchs of Europe, warning that the Mongols were the end of everything. The chronicler Matthew Paris wrote in England that the Mongols were the punishment of God for the sins of Christendom, and that people waited in dread for the news that Vienna had fallen, that Paris was burning. And then, in the spring of 1242, the Mongols stopped. They turned around and went home. The greatest invasion in European history simply ended. The reason was the death of the Great Khan. Boche Khan had died in December 1241, likely from alcohol poisoning after a legendary drinking bout. The news took months to reach the Mongol army in Hungary, traveling by the incredible speed of the Mongol Pony Express system. But when it arrived, everything changed. Mongol law required all princes of the blood to return to Mongolia for the election of a new Great Khan. The commanders, including Batu and Subutai, had no choice. They withdrew. Europe was saved not by any military victory, but by a drinking session on the other side of the world. It is one of the great what-ifs of history. What if Ojde had lived another 5 years? Would the Mongols have reached the Atlantic? Historians still debate this. But Subutai himself, in his letter, spoke confidently of his plan to conquer all the way to the Great Western Sea. The fate of Western civilization may have hung on the liver of a single man. The death of Ojde began a period of internal political struggle that lasted for nearly 2 decades. Different branches of the family fought for the throne. The empire, however, did not collapse. It continued to expand, but the focus shifted. The next great Khan to leave his mark was Mongol, another grandson of Genghis Khan, who came to power in 1251. Mongol was a serious, capable ruler who cracked down on corruption and restarted the engines of conquest. It was under Mongol that the Mongols turned their full attention to the greatest prize of all, the complete conquest of China. The Song dynasty in southern China was the richest, most technologically advanced civilization on Earth. It had a population of over 50 million. It had gunpowder weapons, sophisticated fortifications, and a vast navy. It had resisted Mongol attacks for decades. The conquest of the Song would take over 30 years, longer than any other Mongol campaign. It would require the Mongols to adapt in ways they never had before. They had to build a navy, which they did, using captured Chinese shipwrights. They had to master siege warfare on a scale never before attempted, against cities defended by the latest gunpowder bombs and fire lances. The great general who led this campaign was Kublai, another grandson of Genghis Khan, and the brother of Mongol. When Mongol died in 1259 during the campaign, Kublai returned to Mongolia and claimed the title of Great Khan, defeating his brother Erik Bok in a brief but bitter civil war. Kublai Khan is the most famous of all the Mongol rulers after Genghis himself. He is the one who appears in the travelogue of Marco Polo. He is the one who built the fabled summer palace of Xanadu. He was a complex figure, deeply influenced by Chinese culture, a patron of the arts, a man who sought to rule not just by the sword but by the pen. He moved the imperial capital from Karakoram to Beijing, which he called Khanbalik, the city of the Khan, and he founded the Yuan dynasty, the first foreign dynasty to rule all of China. Under Kublai, the Mongol Empire reached its greatest territorial extent. It was the largest empire the world had ever seen, and it functioned as a single, interconnected unit. The Silk Road, which had been a dangerous and fragmented network of local trade routes, became a single, protected highway stretching from the Pacific to the Mediterranean. The Mongols introduced a unified system of weights and measures, a paper currency backed by the state, and a passport system, the peset, a small metal tablet that granted the bearer the full protection of the Mongol state. Merchants, scholars, and diplomats traveled from Europe to China for the first time. Marco Polo was only the most famous. Nestorian Christian priests, Muslim astronomers, Tibetan lamas, Persian weavers, and Russian metalworkers all found their way to the Mongol court. The world was, for the first time, truly connected. Ideas, technologies, and diseases moved across the Eurasian landmass with a speed that would have been unimaginable a century earlier. Gunpowder went west. The blast furnace, a Chinese invention, went west. Block printing moved along the trade routes. So, tragically, that the Black Death, the bubonic plague that would devastate Europe in the 14th century, is believed by many scholars to have traveled along the Mongol trade routes from its origin point in the steppes of Central Asia. The Mongols, in connecting the world, inadvertently created the pathway for one of the greatest biological catastrophes in human history. Kublai Khan's reign also saw the limits of Mongol power. He launched two massive invasions of Japan, in 1274 and 1281. Both were failures. The second invasion was one of the largest amphibious operations in history until the Normandy landings of World War II. A vast fleet of Korean and Chinese ships, carrying over 100,000 men, descended on the Japanese island of Kyushu. The samurai fought with desperate courage, but they were outmatched by Mongol tactics. It was the weather that saved Japan. A massive typhoon, which the Japanese called the Kanakasi, the divine wind, destroyed the Mongol fleet in a single night of catastrophic storms. The invasion collapsed. Tens of thousands of Mongols, Chinese, and Koreans drowned or were slaughtered on the beaches. Kublai also attempted invasions of Vietnam and Java. They failed, bogged down in the humid, disease-ridden jungles of Southeast Asia, terrain that was completely unsuited to Mongol cavalry tactics. The empire had reached its geographic limit. The unity that Genghis Khan had imposed on his empire did not long survive his grandson Kublai. The Mongol Empire, in theory, was a single entity under the Great Khan. In practice, it had already begun to splinter into four major successor states, known as the Khanates: the Yuan dynasty in the east, ruling China and Mongolia; the Ilkhanate in the southwest, ruling Persia and Mesopotamia; the Chagatai Khanate in the center, ruling the steppes of Central Asia; and the Golden Horde in the northwest, ruling the Russian principalities and the western steppe. These Khanates were ruled by different branches of Genghis Khan's family, and they fought each other almost as often as they fought their external enemies. The Ilkhanate and the Golden Horde went to war over the Caucasus. The Chagatai Khanate and the Yuan dynasty clashed over Central Asia. The idea of a unified Mongol world was dying. In each of the Khanates, something remarkable and paradoxical happened. The Mongols, the great conquerors, were themselves conquered by the cultures they ruled. In China, the Yuan dynasty became increasingly Sinicized. Kublai and his successors adopted Chinese court rituals, patronized Chinese art and literature, and promoted Buddhism. The Mongols in China became a ruling elite, isolated from the native Han population, eventually losing the very military edge that had brought them to power. In Persia, the Ilkhanate converted to Islam. Dasan Khan, the greatest of the Ilkhan rulers, embraced the faith of the people he governed, encouraged a renaissance of Persian art and architecture, and built magnificent structures like the observatory at Merghe. In the Golden Horde, the Mongols also converted to Islam, intermarried with the local Turkic populations, and slowly became the people we know today as the Tatars. They ruled Russia from a distance, collecting tribute through local princes, but they never really became Russian. The Chagatai Khanate, in the heartland of the steppe, held out the longest against assimilation, maintaining the old Mongol ways. But eventually, even they converted to Islam, and their realm fractured into smaller, warring states. One figure stands out from the era of the fragmented empire, and his name has become a byword for terror and destruction. Timur. Known in the West as Tamerlane, Timur was not a descendant of Genghis Khan. He was a Turkic Mongol warlord from the Chagatai Khanate who rose to power in the late 14th century. He claimed to be the restorer of the Mongol Empire, the new Genghis Khan. He married a princess of the line of Genghis to legitimize his rule, and he launched a series of campaigns that rivaled Genghis Khan's in their brutality. He conquered Persia, the Caucasus, Mesopotamia, and northern India. He sacked Delhi, leaving it a city of the dead. He defeated the Ottoman Sultan Bayezid at the Battle of Ankara in 1402, temporarily halting the Ottoman advance into Europe. His pyramid building of skulls was a direct homage to the terror tactics of his Mongol predecessors. When he died in 1405, while planning an invasion of Ming China, his empire quickly fell apart, but his legacy endured. His great-great-grandson, Babur, would later found the Mongol Empire in India, which ruled much of the subcontinent until the British arrived. The shadow of Genghis Khan, stretched through Timur, extended for centuries more. So, what did the Mongol Empire leave behind? The question is not simple. To ask it is to ask about the nature of empire itself. Is an empire measured by what it builds, or by what it destroys? The Mongols destroyed civilizations. The Khwarezmian Empire, which had been a brilliant center of Islamic culture, was so thoroughly annihilated that entire regions of Central Asia never recovered their pre-Mongol population levels. The irrigation systems of Mesopotamia, maintained for millennia, were smashed by the Mongol invasions and never fully rebuilt, contributing to the long-term decline of that region. The city of Baghdad, the fabled capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, the center of the Golden Age of Islam, was sacked by the Mongols under Hulagu Khan in 1258. The caliph was rolled on a carpet and trampled to death by horses, a respectful death for a man of his station, since Mongol tradition held that royal blood should not be spilled on the ground. The great libraries of Baghdad, the house of wisdom, the accumulated knowledge of centuries, was thrown into the Tigris River. Chroniclers said the river ran black with the ink of books and red with the blood of the city's scholars. The destruction of Baghdad was a psychic wound in the Islamic world that some argue is never fully healed. But the Mongols also built. They unified China for the first time in centuries, laying the groundwork for the modern Chinese state. The Ming dynasty that overthrew the Yuan in 1368 inherited a unified, centralized empire with a functioning bureaucracy, a postal system, and a tradition of continental-scale governance that the Mongols had perfected. The Mongols created the conditions for the global exchange of ideas, technology, and culture. The Renaissance in Europe, with its explosion of art and science, was fueled in part by the knowledge that traveled along the Mongol-protected Silk Road. Chinese inventions like gunpowder, the printing press, and the compass reached Europe through Mongol trade routes and transformed European society. Without the Mongols, the world would be unrecognizably different. The very map of the modern world, the distribution of peoples, languages, and religions, was shaped by the Mongol conquests. The genetic legacy of the Mongols is staggering. A famous genetic study published in 2003 found that a single Y chromosome lineage, which can be traced back to Mongolia in the time of Genghis Khan, is shared by roughly 8% of all men in a vast region of Asia, about 16 million living males. This means that around 1 in every 200 men on the planet today is a direct male line descendant of Genghis Khan. He is, in a very literal sense, the father of a significant fraction of humanity. The empire also reshaped the religious map of the world. The Mongols were famously tolerant of religion. Genghis Khan's law, the Yas, mandated religious freedom. The Khan's court included shamans, Buddhists, Christians, Muslims, and Taoists, all debating theology in public disputations. This tolerance was a tool of statecraft, a way of managing a diverse empire, but it had lasting effects. The spread of Tibetan Buddhism in Mongolia and China was facilitated by Mongol patronage. The survival of the Church of the East, the Nestorian Christians, in Central Asia was partly due to Mongol protection. The Mongol story is not a simple one of good versus evil. It is a story of human beings at their most extreme. It is a story of incredible cruelty and incredible genius. The Mongol Empire was a machine that could annihilate a city of 1 million people and then, that generation later, build a system of international trade that would connect the descendants of the survivors to the entire world. It was a paradox of blood and silk, of fire and law, of destruction and creation. When we look back at the Mongols, we are looking at something terrible and awe-inspiring. We are looking at what happens when a people from the edge of survival are united by a single, implacable will. We are looking at the stone from the steppe, a stone that swept across the world and changed it forever. In the echoes of that storm, the hoofbeats of the Mongol horses can still be heard today in the languages we speak, the borders we fight over, in the blood that runs in our veins. The Mongols are not just a chapter in a history book, they are a part of us. 145-155. Part 13 Conclusion. The end of the storm. By the early 15th century, the Great Mongol Empire was effectively done. The Yuan dynasty in China had been overthrown by a peasant rebellion led by Zhou Yuanshan, who founded the Ming dynasty in 1368. The Mongols retreated back to the steppe, back to the grasslands that had spawned them. They would never again rule China. The Golden Horde, weakened by plague and civil war, began to fragment in the 15th century. The Russian princes, led by the Grand Duchy of Moscow, began to defy their Mongol overlords. The famous standoff at the Ugra River in 1480, where the armies of Moscow and the Golden Horde faced each other across the frozen river and then both retreated, is traditionally celebrated as the end of the Tatar yoke. In reality, the decline was slow and messy, but the direction was clear. The Mongol age in Russia was over. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed into internal chaos and was absorbed by local dynasties. The Chagatai Khanate splintered into a patchwork of small states, one of which produced Timur, the last great conqueror of the steppe tradition. By 1500, the Mongol Empire existed only in memory. The steppe nomads who had once held the world in terror were pushed back to their ancestral lands, and tamed by the rising gunpowder empires of the early modern period. The Russian, the Qing Chinese, the Persians, the Ottomans. The world moved on. But the story does not end there. Because the Mongol moment, brief as it was in historical terms, had permanently altered the trajectory of human history. It had broken down the walls between East and West. It had created the first truly global system. It had demonstrated, for the first and perhaps the only time, that a small group of people, united by a shared purpose, could conquer and reshape the entire world. Genghis Khan began his life as an outcast, a hunted boy with nothing but a blood clot in his fist and a mother who dug roots to keep him alive. He ended his life as the ruler of an empire that stretched across half the globe. His story is the most extreme example of what human will, human organization, and human ruthlessness can achieve. The Mongol Empire was the stone of history, and we are still living in its weather.